And I believe we are live. Happy Sunday. All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, thank you so much for showing up. We are going to go ahead and get started. And I am at a little, I've worked here at Fiveable for a little bit. And today we're going to talk about claims and evidence in sources. And I've tentatively put a part 1 down on this because I am not entirely sure how many parts there might be, but it seems as though claims and sources is one of those topics that you really should have a little practice with. So I've tentatively put down part 1, and hopefully maybe we can get some other claims and evidence sources going here in a bit, maybe in the following weeks, just because it is such a necessary skill, and it does require a good deal of practice. So that is why I've tentatively put down part 1, and hopefully we will have additional parts in the future. So if you're just joining us, I have put down, I've thrown out a poll, and if you just go ahead and fill that out so we know where we are. But yeah, we're essentially going to be addressing the topic of claims and evidence in AP World History today, which may seem like a silly thing, if only because, isn't it all about history, right? Students who are new to the class might be thinking, oh, it's world history. Why am I worried about claims and evidence? That sounds like something out of the English class. But as it turns out, in AP World, and AP Euro, and in AP US, being able to work with claims and evidence is a really important part of the class. And so we're gonna dive into that today. Before we get going, though, I just always want to remind you to think Fiveable and go ahead and follow us on any of those platforms there: Twitter, Instagram, YouTube at thinkfiveable. That thing Fiveable. So always that. Let's see. Oops, going backwards. Okay, going forwards. Want to stay forwards. So I'm here with you today. We're going to talk about claims and claims and evidence, but we have some awesome additional streams coming up in the future. This coming week, we have annotating secondary sources, which will actually dovetail quite nicely. So once you've looked at this and done a little practice with analyzing claims and evidence, that will be a really big help when it comes to annotating secondary sources, because you'll have a little bit of practice looking at the claims and evidence those sources might be making. So that'll be a real nice dovetail. I would really encourage you to go ahead and try to get to that one if you can. That'll be on, that's this coming week on the 10th. On the 11th, we have our first zoom into a region of the world with Africa, and we're going to talk about some continuities from classical Africa to medieval Africa. That's going to be held with Charlie. And sorry, I forgot to mention this first one. This annotating will be held with Ali, who's a wonderful AP World teacher in her own right. And then coming up on this week as well, I'll be back, and I will be talking about China. East Asia, but more China in particular, continuities from the classical to the medieval. So we're going to be doing a little bit of continuity, talking about that. And then coming up near the end of this week, we have the short answer questions with Melissa. And since we're actually going to talk a little bit about short answer questions today, I would encourage you to try to make that, and then you can put into practice some of the stuff that you got, that you saw here today. But with that, with those awesome streams coming up in the future, which I highly advise you get to, let's go ahead and get started. Let's see. Oops, I keep hitting the wrong button there. So here's what we're looking at today. This stream is going to kind of roughly tackle 3 areas. One is we're going to talk about what is claims and evidence. What does this term mean? What does this term signify? What did AP World, the writers of the course, have in mind when they said this? Second one is, how do we think about identifying claims and evidence, right? How can we approach this? How can we turn this from a really big, weird word down to something we can really understand? And there will be some more of this at the end. For any teachers who might be out there near the end, I'll have some ways that you can bring practice assignments of identifying claims and evidence into your classroom. And then we'll have some multiple choice as well as some short answer questions and examples to help us kind of wrap our head around it. So that's what we're looking at today. And I'm glad you're with us. And let's go ahead and just get started. So hopefully, if you're a student, your teacher might have used this phrase already, historical reasoning skills. These are the skills that AP World History Modern, or AP Modern World History, as well as AP Euro and AP US also utilize, and this is how to think about history. And so a lot of what you'll read about in your textbook will be the content, the dates, the places, and the times, and the people, and the wars, and the treaties, and all that good stuff. But these historical reasoning skills are really kind of what you do with that, kind of what you make of it. And so today we're going to look at analyzing claims and evidence. And this is skill number 3 out of 7, as you can see right here, claims and evidence in sources. And it is asking students to analyze arguments in primary and secondary sources. As you can also see, it has 4 breakdowns, it has 4 parts. Oops, I keep hitting that wrong button, I'm so sorry. So this is one of 6 primary historical reasoning skills, and claims and evidence is going to be on your AP exam. I know it sounds a little redundant to say this, but just so we're totally clear. You'll find these on your multiple choice questions. You'll find these in your short answer questions, and you'll also find an element of these in your document-based questions. Does anybody notice what element of the AP exam does seem to be missing from this particular list? Anybody point it out? What element? We have the multiple choice, we have our SAQs, and we have our document-based questions. What are we missing? What do we need to complete the tetrarch of AP exam elements? Anybody got it? Give you a hint, it starts with an L. All right, well, it's the LEQ, aka the long essay question. And part of the reason why claims and sourcing isn't on there is because, oh, yep, Joshua, yeah, you got it, it's the LEQ. And part of the reason they are not on there is simply because in an LEQ, you're not going to be working with sources. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use sources on your LEQ, as in you can bring in knowledge that you've gained from other sources. But in the strict sense of the word, LEQs don't involve using sources. And so for that reason, multiple choice questions, short answer questions, and document-based questions, all of whom do use sources, are going to be where you'll encounter questions that will ask you to explore claims and evidence in said sources. And so today, in particular, this tentative part 1 of hopefully what will be more parts, we're just going to be looking at the identification element of this. If you notice on the sides, there's 4 parts, and 3 of them are primarily concerned with identification. So it's these 3 right here, 3A, 3B, and 3C, which include identifying the claim, identifying the evidence used to support the claim, and then being able to compare 2 arguments or main ideas of 2 sources. Now, this involves a little bit more than identification, but identification is a big part of this 3C. And so today we're going to kind of limit ourselves just to this, because explaining how claims or evidence support or modify an argument of a source, that's a little more DBQ specific, although you do see that on SAQs occasionally. And so I think this is a topic worthy of its own stream, I believe, because there's a lot to it. And so we're going to go ahead and save that for another day. And today we're just going to focus on identification. So how should we think about claims and evidence? Real quick, what was your favorite book? Go ahead and throw this in the chat because I'm curious. We're going to come back to this. What is your favorite book from English class that you've read? You know, in English class, we all got to read a bajillion different books, but which one is your favorite? I know there's probably a lot you had to read that you didn't really like, but what was your favorite English book, the book that you read in English class? I think for me personally, I really liked The Great Gatsby. I thought that was an excellent book. And I also thought Animal Farm was a nice book. I don't know if anyone else is an Animal Farm fan. Since I know we have all you know, AP World is taken by all grades, we can see a plethora of books. Yeah, Catcher in the Rye. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, my brother is a big fan of Catcher in the Rye. A lot of my students right now, as I teach sophomores, a lot of them are reading Julius Caesar, which I think is very appropriate, although somewhat unfortunate that Julius Caesar is no longer officially in the AP World curriculum, but that's a book they're reading. So, and I want you to hold on to that book name because we're going to come back to that. So just hold on to that. So I had to throw it in the chat so you can easily reference it. We're going to come back to that. But let's break down how you can think about claims and evidence for just a second. So how can you think about identifying claims and evidence? Well, you have a source, right? And essentially, you have to identify what this source is arguing and what do they use to support their argument. And so identifying is the key word because you're merely looking for what is the claim and you're looking for what is the evidence. Now, the beautiful thing about this historical reasoning skill is that this actually doesn't require any content knowledge of the document you're working with. And I'm going to show you this later. I know it sounds hard to believe. I mean, I don't have to know exactly when this happened. I don't have to know the date that this person lived. I don't have to know when this war happened. And the answer is, in a strict sense, no, you don't. Now, would that help immensely? Oh, yes. Yes, it would. But in the strict sense of the word, it's important to understand that when identifying claims and evidence, it's not content knowledge required, right? You're looking for the source's argument, and you're looking for the source's evidence. That means that you are limited just to this source, this one source, right? You don't need to bring in necessarily anything else. Now, there might be, especially in multiple choice, there might be questions, and they will ask you to bring in other things. But in the strictest sense of the word, you don't actually have to bring in anything outside the source unless you're explicitly told to. And so for that reason, a claims and evidence question is limited exactly to the source that you're working with. Kind of a relief, right? So with that in mind, I'd like to show you an example. This will be a multiple choice question we're going to look at. And I'm going to walk you through this first one because it's got a very long piece of text. And I'm going to sort of read it for you, break it down for you. And then I will give you an additional multiple choice question that won't be as long, so to speak. And you guys can go ahead and try out that one. Or actually, sorry, I'm getting way ahead of myself here. I haven't even told you about that English textbook, that English book I was asking you about. So think about this, that English book that you really loved, right? The one that you loved from class. I'm sure when you read that book in class, you probably had to write an essay about it. And for example, when I read Animal Farm by George Orwell, I had to explain why Animal Farm was an excellent book. And so I wrote something along these lines. Animal Farm by George Orwell is great because it presents all animals equal in the eyes of the laws framed by them. They framed 10 Commandments when they expelled Mr. Jones from Manor Farm, and this rule, all animals are equal, became central for them. I had to write this about Animal Farm. And so if this is my source, right, pretend that this is your source. right? Pretend that this is the source. The question you would then be addressing is, what is the claim that's being made in the source, and what evidence supports this claim? So I had to argue about why Animal Farm was an excellent book, and I also had to argue that some evidence for why that is. And so if with just this little teeny tiny passage right here, what is the claim that I'm making, and then what evidence is supporting it? And I encourage you to think about English class, because this is usually something that is done in English class long before you get to AP World History. You're probably doing this in English class long before you came to AP World. And so I encourage you to think back to English class whenever you encounter something like this. So go ahead and, this is, 2 sentences. Go ahead and tell me what is the claim that's being made here, right? Animal Farm by George Orwell is great. What claim is being made here? What argument is being made here? And then what evidence? And I'll point out on this word because. If you see this word, it usually is immediately followed by the evidence, right? If you've ever seen this word, yada, 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 because, yada, yada, yada. So let's take a look really quick. Oops, I don't know why it's doing that. So here's the source that you're looking at. And so what is the claim? Well, the claim is that Animal Farm is great. It says right there, Animal Farm is great. This is a claim that's being made. And then it's great because it presents all animals as equal. Notice that because, I'm referencing that because. And then this claim goes on to mention the 10 Commandments and all animals being equal. So for example, if you had to write, if you had to make a claim about, say, Catcher in the Rye, if that was a book you read for English, or if you had to make a claim about, say, Romeo and Juliet, which I'm sure some of you might have read early in your high school careers, then perhaps your claim would be that Romeo and Juliet acted foolishly, and then you might present some evidence. Or your claim might be that Romeo and Juliet are the embodiment of true love because, and then you might present your evidence. So whenever you encounter a question like this, a sourcing question, and we'll talk a little bit about how to identify one. I would always encourage you to think back to English class, because again, this is something you've probably been doing in English class for a very long time. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example. Interesting, let's do this. So when it comes to multiple choice questions, you'll see one of several types of questions. So you'll see questions that will simply ask you to identify the claim. They'll ask you to identify the evidence, or they might ask you to compare 2 arguments. Sometimes you'll get a multiple choice question with 2 different sources. That's a bit rare, but you do tend to see it. And usually they'll be arguing one side of a big historical event, or they might be arguing the other side of a big historical event. And so with those questions that you might see, those claims and evidence questions are simply asking you to identify the difference in the arguments and the evidence they use to support themselves. Any questions before we continue, before we go ahead and take a look at that first multiple choice question? All right, let's go ahead and look at this. Oh, what a doozy. Look at all that text. Yikes. Well, one thing to always remember, and it is entirely possible that you will encounter a question on the AP exam that is this large. One thing to always remember when encountering texts, lots of text. Does anyone know what that is? The number one rule that all AP students should follow when you encounter a large body of text. What should you do? What's the one thing you should always do when reading a large body of text? Does anyone know? Does anyone have the magic answer? And I'll give you another hint. It starts with an A. The magic A word. Bingo. Bingo. Susan got it. Annotate. Yes, we always want to annotate. And I know maybe your teacher hasn't told you that it's required, but even if they haven't, you always want to annotate. And the reason is because it helps you keep track of what you're reading. And in this case, if you're looking for a claim and you're looking for what evidence supports that claim, then you definitely want to annotate so you can quickly identify what those things are. And if you need to go back and look at this later for whatever reason, say if this is this is part of an SAQ and not part of a multiple choice question, then that would be helpful. So always annotate. If you don't, that's my strongest recommendation to you. So here we go. Boozy, big old text, lots of text. So let's take a look at this. This is a quote from a Spanish soldier and a historian. Oh, okay, so they're a historian and a soldier. That's interesting. That's a rare combination. The Chronicles of Peru, 1553. Also notice I didn't immediately start reading the text. The first thing I did was go down and read the source, which is another thing I would always strongly recommend doing. Helps put you in the mindset for this text. So, alrighty, let's see. One of the things that struck me was the great, splendid highways. Whoops, sorry about that. Go back to that. Back to that previous slide. Well, okay, never mind. Let's go ahead and read it. I've pre-annotated this already. So one of the things that struck me was the great, splendid highways. And okay, so this is definitely about roads. And I wondered how many men it must have required to build them, and what tools and instruments were used to level the mountains and cut through the rock and make them as broad and good as they are. It seems to me that the King of Spain wanted to build a highway from Quito to Cusco. I do not think that he could do it, even with all his power, unless he followed the method that the Inca employed. It's interesting he references the King of Spain's power, because this time in history, the King of Spain was pretty powerful. So that's an interesting reference to make. He couldn't do it with all his power unless he followed the method the Incas employed. When an Inca king decided to build one of these highways, all he needed to do was give the command. Then the inspectors would go out through the provinces, laying out the highways routes and assigning Indians to help them build the roads. Okay, interesting. So we know this has something to do with highways. And that's interesting. You know, they use the word highway, but something tells me they're not talking about highways in the sense that we know them today. It's maybe a synonym for roads. But let's see, the question asks, which of the following pieces of evidence does the author most directly use in support of his argument about the King of Spain following the Inca method of highway construction? So really quick, I'd like to point out that this is asking about evidence and used to support his argument. And an argument is another word for a claim. So a good way to read this question is, which of the following pieces of evidence does the author most directly use to support his claim? What's his claim about? His claim is about the King of Spain, following the Inca method of highway construction. So evidence regarding a claim about Spain and highway construction. So let's go ahead and take a look. So question A, or possibility A, the Inca rulers constructed roads to help complete conquests. Well, now, Is that correct for those of us who just thinking about how an empire is built? Is it possible, do we know of empires that have used roads or communication to complete conquests? Have we heard of an empire like that before? Maybe back in Unit 0 from before 1200, have we heard of an empire or an empire afterwards that used some sort of transportation method to complete a conquest? Have we heard of that happening before? And go ahead and if anyone has any thoughts, they can go ahead and throw that just in the comment section. I'd be curious though, have we heard of an empire using roads or maybe some kind of water transportation to complete a conquest? The Persians, yes, the Persians are one of them. The Persian Royal Road, which wasn't strictly speaking a road for conquest, but it did help the Persians solidify their conquest. The Romans are another one that comes to mind, yeah. The famous Roman roads that spread all over Europe. So even though you don't actually have to know this, the answer, this statement in its historical sense is true. The Inca did use roads to complete their conquest, but remember how I said earlier, you only have to stick to the source, right? You only have to stick to this. You don't have to know that the Inca used their roads to complete their conquest. It would help, but maybe in this case, it might actually hurt you because you might see this and jump to the answer. And there's nothing in this statement about conquest. It's the first thing I'd like to point out, is that there's nothing in this statement about conquest. And so you might know that, and you might know that that's true, but you need to be careful because there's nothing in here about conquest. And they don't talk about war, they don't talk about anything. It's just talking about roads. Let's see what else there is. Before we go any further, I threw out a poll with B, D, and C, or B, C, and D, just because I gave away A already. What do you guys think? What's in this particular question about sourcing and evidence, what do you think this answer is? Is it B, is it C, or is it D? Is it Incan rulers commanded their officials to construct highways quickly? Was it Inca rulers marked their kingdoms with boundaries? Or is it that Inca rulers could acquire specialized tools to cut through the mountains? What do we think? Take a second. What's it going to be? B, C, or D? Keeping in mind that you're just limited to this document. You're not looking outside. You're just sticking with what's in here. All right, we got a few. We got some guesses. Well, it looks like there's a clear front runner here. All right, looks like the majority is solidly in favor of a very particular answer, and I'll address that. But let's break down all of them first before we go and reveal the big reveal. So, it's not A because there's nothing about conquest in here. And it's not C because there's nothing in here about boundaries, nothing in here about borders. No one's talking about the frontier of a kingdom. No one in here is talking about the edge of a kingdom. They're just talking about highways. So it isn't C because there's no mention of boundaries here. And it's not D. The Inca rulers could acquire specialized tools to cut through the mountains. Well, There is a mention of tools, right? I wonder how many men it must have required to build them, and what tools and instruments were used to level the mountain to cut through the rocks. Now, it could be entirely possible the Incas had specialized tools. There is still some debate among archaeologists for how they got some of their stone structures so neatly aligned without some of the same mathematical concepts that were in Eurasia. But there's nothing in here about those specialized tools, and that's nothing the author would potentially know about. In fact, he even says, I don't know, I wonder, right? So there's mentions of tools, but this isn't connected to the King of Spain. Because remember, this argument is about the King of Spain. This is what we're asking about. And so it comes down to B, which is the correct answer, because we know that the King of Spain and highway construction, the author uses this evidence about the Inca king only has to give commands, and then it was done, right? So this is connected to the King of Spain, right? That the King of Spain, that he could do it even with all of his power. I do not think that he could do it even with all of his power unless he followed the methods of the Incas. And what were the methods of the Incas? Just gave the command, and then boom, there it is. So remember that you do come with knowledge. I'm sure, and it's a little early in the year to be talking about the Incas. Maybe some of you have addressed them already, maybe you haven't. But just remember that claims and sources, claims or arguments, those are specifically limited to this document themselves. So don't necessarily get lost trying to think about other things outside of this document. This is all you need. All you need is this document. Imagine if the Beatles had written a song about that. Probably wouldn't have been a hit. Okay. Are there any questions about this before we move on? Okay. And I should also say, it's not impossible, but it is unlikely you'd see a text this large on the AP exam. Most of the texts on the you may encounter one or two, but recently it seems as though a lot of text-based stimulus on the AP exam have tended a little towards the shorter side. You may still see a couple that are multiple paragraphs, but usually they will be limited to one paragraph, maybe two. Very rarely you might see a 3-paragraph stimuli, but just for some context. Let's go ahead and take a look at an image-based question from a multiple choice question. So this is slightly different, but let's take a look at this. And there were no questions about this example. So let's take a look at a second one. So here's a map. Interesting. 15th century map of Constantinople. By the way, Constantinople was the capital of an empire. Does anyone know what empire that was? That is the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines, also sometimes known as the Eastern Romans. So this example is showing you a map of the city, and then it indicates something about the city. So this map is making a claim about the city, and you're being asked to identify what that claim is. Or another way to think about this is, here's a list of claims, right? A, B, C, D, E are a list of claims, a list of arguments, and you're being asked to identify which one is indicated by this map. This map is your piece of evidence, and this is your list of claims. So I'd like you to take a look at it for a second and go ahead and see if you could figure out A, B, C, or D, or E. Which of these is supported by this map of Constantinople? And just in case you're wondering, this darker color that you see at this part of the map, this is actually water. So just in case you're wondering what this is water. So throwing it up on a poll. Go ahead and take a little bit. Let's see. Any thoughts here? What we got? A few. So let's go ahead and break this down. Seems as though the people have spoken. Let's go ahead and break this down. So, what are possibilities? A, B, C, D. Well, located on an island. The claim is Constantinople is located on an island being a body of land surrounded by water. Well, here's a bunch of water. There's some land, and there's a bridge, it looks like, but this part is definitely land. So this map does not support the idea that it's located on an island. Valued and rewarded people of all classes. Well, I'm not sure how you'd come to that conclusion from a map. Honestly, it's hard to say. How do you define valuing and rewarding of all classes? It just seems this is a kind of answer that would be very hard to prove from a visual like a map. So it most likely is not this answer. Looked down on trade and commerce. Well, it's a city surrounded by water, but we can see that it looks like there's a bridge going to it. And it looks like they have a harbor. This might be a harbor right here, this little blue spot. Looked down on trade and commerce. Again, this is just kind of one of those things that it doesn't look like you could say with 100% certainty looking at this map. They look down on trade and commerce. I don't know how you could see that. There just doesn't seem to be any evidence of it, right? I mean, how do you know what element of this image says, oh, we don't like trade or commerce? Tolerated many religions. Well, you could potentially glean that if you could note, for example, maybe you could see if there are numerous other religious buildings, right? So maybe you could look for multiple different religious buildings. And that could be evidence of this claim that the Byzantines tolerated many religions. As it stands, all I can see is several churches. A church there with a little cross, church there with a little cross. And by the way, does anybody know what famous church was located in Constantinople? I shouldn't say was. Is located in Constantinople. Has anyone heard of this? Or seen it? It's very famous. It's one of the most famous churches that is not a church anymore. Its name means holy wisdom in Greek. Does anybody know holy wisdom in Greek? Any guesses? Any takers? Hagia Sophia, yes, yes. Hagia Sophia is one of the great contributions to history of the Byzantine empires and Byzantine emperors. Supposedly, Justinian, who began the construction of the Hagia Sophia and saw it finished, wanted it to be even greater than the temple that had existed in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus of Nazareth and the Jews, and that was constructed originally by Solomon, the king of Israel. And so when the church was completed, he was alleged to have said, Solomon, I have surpassed you. This is how great this church will be. And as you can see, there is this is the Hagia Sophia over here, this building just off to the right. Even in old maps, it was so prominent you couldn't miss it. But again, that doesn't indicate whether many religions were tolerated, and that's why the best answer is B. Because what can we see? What can we see from this painting, right? What can you see on this map that would definitely indicate this city is fortified? What do you see here that totally makes it clear that this was a fortified city? Anybody know what these things are? These lovely things I'm running my cursor around. These are the city walls. And another fun fact, if you go to visit Constantinople, now it's known as Istanbul, but if you go to visit, you can actually see the city walls. Constantinople itself changed hands. It became part of the Ottoman Empire, which we'll learn about shortly in 1453, but the new Ottoman government actually never tore down the walls. And even though Istanbul is a much bigger city than it was back then, those walls are still there, and you can go see them. There have been some weird patchwork restoration jobs, but for the most part, they're there. The government left them alone, and animals crawl around them, and sometimes homeless people live inside them, but they're there. So if you ever find yourself going out towards Turkey, you can go see the walls of Constantinople yourself. They're still there. But to the point of this question, right? This is a kind of question where we had evidence and we were identifying the correct claim that could be supported by this evidence, whereas the previous question, we had a claim and we were looking for the evidence of that claim. So we were practicing both 3-point A and 3-point B, right? We were looking for evidence and then we were looking for a claim. All right, so we're good with the multiple choice questions. A few tips for when you're approaching a multiple choice question in claims and sourcing. So the first thing, and I already said it, is annotate. You definitely want to annotate. And that goes for images too. You can annotate in images, and we're about to see in a second, right? It'll help you keep track, right? You won't get lost staring at a blob of text. Use process of elimination, right? As we think about that last example, it wasn't immediately clear that the answer was B. And there were some other questions that you also seemed possible or plausible, right? But you can eliminate them down. And the beautiful thing about process of elimination is, even if you have to guess, it's much better to guess with a higher probability than it is to guess with a lower probability. A 1 in 4 guess is a 25% chance, and a 1 in 2 guess is a 50% chance. And I would personally rather have a 50% chance than a 25% chance. So use process of elimination. It is your friend. And last but not least, do stick to the document. Unless it explicitly tells you that you're comparing this document to something else, don't leave this document. Stick to that source. And be careful with what outside information you bring in, because you need to be explicitly staying on that document. You might know things about the Inca, you might know things about the city of Constantinople, but those questions are explicitly asking about that document. So unless it tells you, you definitely want to stick to that document. All right. Are there any additional questions before we go ahead and move on to short answer questions? Okay. So let's talk about short answer questions. By the way, real quick, does anybody know how many short answer questions you're required to answer on the AP exam, just while we're here? Anybody know the magic number? If you've ever heard that song, something is a magic number. Well, yep, 3. That's also a great song, by the way. 3 is a magic number. Look at that song. It's a great song. 3, right? And so it's entirely possible you could get an SAQ that is either totally or mostly connected with claims and evidence. So that's we're gonna look at an example here to help get you guys familiar with that. So the thing about these short answer questions is they could address all parts of this. So identifying, comparing, and possibly even talking about how to modify an argument. But we're not actually going to look at 3D today. We're just going to look at C, B, and A, just because those are the ones we're sticking to. But it is possible that you could get a question like asking you to consider the evidence and how it modifies a claim. So we probably won't actually, we're not going to look at that today, but just something to think about. Okay, so let's take a look. Sorry, let's take a look at this SAQ. So this is a modified version of a previous SAQ from a number of years ago, and it has these 2 pictures. We're going back to pictures, and this picture on the top is Gandhi during the Salt March. And this picture on the left is a guy named Che Guevara in Cuba in 1959. Interesting. And so this SAQ is asking you to explain one difference in the tactics individuals such as Gandhi and Che Guevara, or the groups they represented, adopted to achieve their political goals. And so in this instance, what we're looking at is we're looking to find evidence for the tactics they used, right? Identifying the evidence, but also identifying the claims. And so we have these 2 images, and right off the bat, even if you don't know, again, let's say you don't know anything about either Gandhi or Che Guevara, what do you notice about these 2 images? What seems to be a really big kind of, well, that caught my eye kind of thing about these pictures? They wouldn't notice anything. This gentleman right here, I might add, is Gandhi. This one in the center of this photo, and this is Che Guevara in the center of this photo. Anything kind of jump out at you? They're both in black and white, yes. How they're dressed, that's definitely one thing that jumped out at me. Right, if you notice here, Gandhi doesn't even have shoes, and a lot of his followers don't have shoes either. Whereas over here, Che and his followers, they seem to be not only dressed, but they've got other things with them too. What am I seeing on this gentleman's back and around his waist? And it's kind of hard to see, but underneath, Che has over his shoulder, he's got an additional object. What objects are these we're looking at here? These are weapons. These are guns. And in particular, in the background, it's a gigantic tank. Like this is just like towering over. These are just towering over shit. It's a tank. It's a massive tank. Whereas Gandhi, in fact, doesn't have any weapons. Right? That's simply a walking. These are walking sticks. Somebody once thought this was a sword, but this is just a walking stick. It's already. We just kind of look at this and we can see. Oh, look, the tank, guns, versus walking stick, no shoes. One side looks positively militant, and the other side does not. So if you had to explain a difference in the tactics involved just from these two photos, what might you say? If you had to just identify, now this specific question is to explain, but if you just had to identify a difference in their tactics, these groups who were revolutionary groups in the 20th century, what statement could you make just from pulling these two photos? You don't know anything else. Just these two photos are all you've got. You need to talk about how their tactics are different. What points? What's a point that you could make? Knowing the, just from what you can see right here, what point, what could be said if you had to compare or contrast these? Well, you could say that one practices a form of nonviolence while the other one has a degree of militancy. That's something you could say. So if you were being asked to identify what these difference in the tactics of these groups, you could say one probably practices a form of nonviolence and one probably practices a more militant form of violence in achieving their goals. Now, what I would like to point out is that in this case, this particular question, which says explain, this is where you would need to pull in some background information. Because if you don't know anything about Che and you don't know anything about Gandhi, and at this early in the year, I would not expect you to know anything deep about either of those. Maybe you've seen Che on a t-shirt. His picture is pretty famous. And maybe you've heard of Gandhi. Maybe you've seen the movie about Gandhi. But at this early in the year, you definitely wouldn't be talking about them in your history classes. So in this case, if you were just identifying, you could make a statement about nonviolence versus violence. But to explain it, you would need to bring in some outside evidence. And so while sticking to sources is important, it's also important to remember that you do need to sometimes pull outside information, especially if it's asking you to explain. And so let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So here's a possible answer to this statement. So the major difference in tactics between those groups led by Guevara and by Gandhi is that Guevara was a socialist and believed in revolution, even violent, was necessary. Gandhi, on the other hand, was dedicated to his nonviolent principle of ahimsa and pursuing political freedom. So again, if you're not aware of the background of Che being a socialist, a communist sometimes, if you will, and of Gandhi practicing a principle he calls ahimsa, then you might not be able to fully explain, right? You could probably identify just from these photos, you could say, hey, nonviolence, somewhat militant, if not violent, right? From the gun, from the tank, from the military uniform, you could make a point about perhaps militancy. But if you were being asked to explain it, you might have a hard time. And so this is kind of one of those things where you need to bring in a little background information. But again, if you were only being asked to identify, you could make a point about nonviolence versus violence, perhaps. Are there any questions about that before we go ahead and wrap this whole thing on up? Okay, so let's go ahead and a few more things. So tips for thinking about claims and sources, especially as it applies to a short answer question. Now, I like this image here that I've included with the TV because it does imply that you need to bring in a little outside information, especially in SAQs. In multiple choice questions, you stick to the document, whatever they've given you, or documents, if they've given you two. But when it comes to SAQs, you do need to bring in a little outside information. It's just sort of inevitable that you need a little bit. And so, for example, before answering that question about Gandhi and Che Guevara, you should probably make little notes on the side about Che Guevara, communist, active in Cuba, Argentina, Chile, the Congo, versus Gandhi, India, against the British, nonviolent, and just anything you can think of about these particular documents. That would really help. Annotating, if you will, right? It goes back to that annotating. Always want to annotate. So you definitely want to contextualize it, and of course you want to annotate it because this will help you put your thoughts in order when answering these questions. And again, unless it actively tells you to go outside the document, you definitely want to stick to it. Now, again, this is a little different than in a multiple choice question. In a multiple choice question, you really, unless the question asks you to compare it to something else, you definitely want to stick just to that document. Whereas in an SAQ, you may need to bring in outside information about those particular documents, right? Not additional documents, but you need to bring in information about other documents. So these are things to think about. But never go too far out. Never go, if you're a baseball fan, don't go, out of left field when it comes to documents. So if you are answering the question about Che Guevara, you don't necessarily want to suddenly start talking about, the history of communism or socialism. And if you're talking about Gandhi, you don't necessarily need to write a whole paragraph on his views on ahimsa, right? Don't go too far out of left field. You need to stick to the document at hand. And that's a general rule of thumb. But when it comes to identifying claims, it also helps. So I want to show you a few examples of the terminology. This way you could identify, when you see them, possible evidence and claims questions. So one thing I already said is if you see the word argument, just swap out the word argument for the word claim, right? This is a good way to figure it out. If you see the word argument, swap out the word argument for the word claim. Or if you just straight up see the word claim, then you know it's a claims and evidence question. If you see the word evidence, then you know it's a claims and evidence question. Identify one piece of evidence to support the author's claim. Now, what's interesting about this question here is you need to first identify the author's claim and then go find the evidence. So remember that evidence supports the claim, and so it's really important to be able to identify that claim. Remember in the Inca question, the claim was about the King of Spain and his power. It wasn't necessarily about the highways themselves. That was just the evidence. And so this is one you see sometimes. It's identify a piece of evidence that a historian could use to argue. And if you remember that argument is just another word for a claim, you're looking for a piece of evidence a historian could use to make a point about such and such. This is also searching for evidence. But in this case, they will tell you what the claim is, and then you just have to go find the piece of evidence to support it. And so again, if you take anything away from this particular live stream, this session that we've had here, it's that it really is just looking within the source that you're given, right? It's about what is the speaker or the author or the writer saying? What are they trying to argue for? And then what are they using to support their evidence? And I would always encourage you, if you ever feel lost in a question like that, is just go back to English class. Think about English class. Think about the writing you've done in English class. You've probably had to talk about a book like Catcher in the Rye, perhaps, and you've probably had to say something about Holden Caulfield. You've had to make a claim about Holden Caulfield, saying something like, Holden Caulfield is suffering from trauma, or Holden Caulfield is immature, or something. You've had to make a claim at some point in a writing assignment. And so you're just doing the same thing except in reverse. Instead of making a claim, you're identifying a claim. And so again, if you feel lost, just think about English class. It's not wrong. It's not a bad thing. And we're going to round this off with just a few ways. If there are any teachers in the stream, or if you just have any students here with us, here are a couple of ways that you can practice identifying claims in class. These are just some fun ways I've used with my students, and I would encourage you can even just do it on your own. You don't even have to wait to be in class. One is to simply go ahead and use advertisements. Really old advertisements from the 50s did a pretty good job of just straight up saying, this is what your thing is going to do. So this candy bar, Baby Ruth, hands up if you like Baby Ruths. We love them. Can't live without them. This candy bar will do these things. You can run around the bases nearly 27 times on one Baby Ruth. So what's the claim? Well, there it is right there. What's the evidence? Right here. So a lot of old ads did a pretty good job of identifying claims. And you can also read the newspaper. Right? The newspaper stories will usually have claims and evidence built into them. Such and such happened and was good, and this is why. These are just a couple ways you can practice. You don't need to necessarily bust out the historical documents to get a little practice in with claims and evidence. Yeah. And of course, you could, though, if you wanted to, if you happen to be in a class or you work with a class that is really strong with reading, then you could just bust out the primary and secondary sources every single day and practice. If you really want to skip the fluff and just go right to, I shouldn't say fluff. You want to just skip the fun way and go right to the serious stuff, then yeah, you could go ahead and do that. Just bust out the primary and secondary sources every day. But this is pretty much all I've got for you. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. But if not, I understand it's getting a little bit late. And people probably have other things they need to do. So I'll stay here for a few more minutes, but I want to thank all of you for coming. And hopefully I'll see you again this Wednesday. And if not, then I hope you check out the other awesome, amazing streams that are coming out with our other wonderful AP World Fiveable hosts. I would encourage you to check those out. And of course, continue to think Fiveable. And Susan and Eric, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you in this. And anybody else who stuck around again, thank you so much for coming and checking it out. All right.